This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. Come Carpentier de Gourdon has been invited to talk to me today once again. Com, as viewers of this platform know, has a unique vantage point. He spent large parts of his childhood and growing up years in India, continues to spend a part of his time in India, but he's a Frenchman and is a dedicated analyst of Europe. So, in a sense, he's a bridge between India and Europe. And of course, he understands France very well, his home country. Combe, welcome. Let me begin by asking you, this is not the result most people expected from the French elections.
Well, I never thought that the National Rally was likely to get an absolute majority. And they had made it clear that unless they got an absolute majority, they wouldn't accept to enter into any government or to run any government. And I think they were right. And in fact, I suspect they felt that it was not a viable option to try to run a government in the current situation. France is in a very complicated economic, political, and social situation. And at this juncture, seeing that all the state structures are pretty much lined against them, and that there is tremendous hostility towards the National Rally and towards what you might call the nationalist right in general from a large section of the electorate, which in fact happens to be in some cases quite violent, it would probably have been a recipe for widespread unrest and possibly even some sort of insurrection. Remember that we are only 2 weeks away from the Olympic Games, so it's a worst possible time to have massive turmoil in the country. And in my view, it's probably not a bad news for the National Rally to have strengthened its position, 50% more deputies, but to have remained outside power because it's not yet ready for them. And by the way, I'm not implying that they are ready for power themselves, because after all, they have never really exercised it. But by and large, their profile has improved steadily over the last 20 years. Remember, it's a 52-year-old party. So they do have long experience of being in politics, but they have, at least their leaders do, but they have never actually practiced power. And there is a system in France which is set not to allow them in. I mean, it's a very clear policy. For example, remember, with the current showing of the National Rally on the second round, if they had been in England under the British electoral system, they would have swept the polls because they got about 1/3 of the electorate, and so did Labour. But with the system prevalent in Britain, Labour was able to catch 410 seats, whereas the National Rally is only getting about 140, which is less than 1/3. So as far as they're concerned, they can play a very definitive role as far as acting as a real opponent and being able to put pressure on the government. And yet, at the same time, they are doing better than most of their individual rivals. Because remember, when the news title, as they did today, that the left wing won, that's a very inaccurate statement. Number one, because the left is made up of 6 parties that don't agree on almost anything. So it's just an ad hoc alliance they made in order to try to somehow get closer to power. And second, if you total all their votes, they are at 180 or something. So, but individually, each party, including the Unsubmitted France, which is the leading left-wing party and so-called far left, that one got only 72 seats, if I remember right. So half of the National Rally. So they can hardly claim to be winning, and yet they immediately laid a claim to power. Mélenchon said he wanted to be prime minister. And of course, his agenda seems very radical because he wants to bring back retirement age at 60. He wants to make immigration much easier by introducing laws which make all so-called climate refugees eligible for residence and then citizenship in France. And his very outspoken vision is that of a France that would have 100 million citizens, including about half from Africa or Asia. So he's talking about, he wants what he called a métis society, which in France means a mixed blood society. Now that, of course, he probably doesn't realize it, but that was the term métis, mestizo in Spanish, was coined by the Spanish colonizers in the 16th century, and it basically means crossbreed as you apply to animals. So essentially, the concept of having a crossbreed society looks quite racistic in a way, but he probably doesn't realize that and thinks it's a very wonderful idea. Now, people obviously should be free to marry whoever they want, and the race should not be an obstacle. However, to make that a state policy is definitely strange. And it seems to be just directly intended to dilute the original identity of France. So there is a big part of the left that shares this view. And that's why a lot of people, among other reasons, why a lot of people are very concerned about the relative rise of the left.
This all sounds absolutely, bewildering, to be honest, Combe. And of course, in this conversation, you'll help us unpack this. Mechelon, who you just mentioned, he seems to believe that French society should go through something called creolization. Now,
Yes.
there is no definition of creolization. And he says very proudly that actually it should never be defined. And this after the society goes through creolization, no one owns this society, in his words. So no one has ownership of this society. What does this even mean, Combe?
It's a very radical idea, which is essentially meant to pander to a large section of the electorate, which is his core electorate. And that means the large immigration, particularly from North Africa. Most of them vote for him because they see, or at least believe, that he's giving them the best possible deal. Along with that, he has got a very socialistic program. He wants to tax the rich a lot more. He wants to increase minimum salary and social provisions for the poor. And he wants, as I said, to reduce the age of retirement because he wants to bring it back to 60 when in fact it has been raised to 64. But as you know, France is under very strict guidelines now from the International Monetary Fund and the European Union and the Central Bank of Europe to cut back on its social spending and reduce its social expenses because they have gone out of control. And France is suffering from a chronic, massively increasing deficit, which makes it a target of European restrictions, just as Greece was a few years ago, which essentially means that pensions and salaries would have to be slashed and all sorts of things that obviously the French people wouldn't take kindly to. So the socialist programs are not only irresponsible, largely, but they are also unfeasible because the European Union would not allow France to go that way. They would put them under very strict sanctions, and the first thing that would happen is that they would simply no longer buy the French government bonds. So France would be unable to finance its budget deficits. And remember, France now has over 3 trillion of foreign debt, basically, that they have to pay, and interest rates have increased because France has lost some of its rating. It was downgraded. So there are all these problems which hardly anybody talks about in the official media because they are embarrassing ideas, and the politicians surf on the belief among many people that they can somehow change things. In fact, they can't, because in the end, they have to report to the EU. And if they are not satisfying the conditions, then France can really go into a tailspin.
And you're saying none of this is actually debated and deliberated in French media, which again sounds quite astounding. I'm particularly intrigued by one of the comments you made that the far left, which claims to have one power, but as you mentioned, that the party making the most noise among the group of parties that have got the maximum number of seats, actually has got only 72 seats, which is half of what Marine Le Pen's party has got. And yet the leader of that party wants to be, the prime minister. He's asked for the president to resign, Macron to resign. One of the intriguing ideas that you just brought onto the table, which seemed quite stunning to me, is that at a time when immigration is creating so much turmoil, you are saying the far left in France actually wants to open the gates even further to quote unquote climate change refugees. How are climate change refugees even defined in France, Com?
They are not. That's just an idea that came out of the woke ideology, that somehow if people can't live in their country because it's too hot or it rains too much or it's too dry, then they have to be given asylum. I understand some people will indeed move in large numbers when they are in hostile circumstances and when their environment has deteriorated beyond the point where they can make a decent life living. But the idea that you somehow have to accept them on that basis, apart from all the other criteria that are already acknowledged, means that you basically would have to give asylum and provide welcome to practically half of the African population. And obviously that's not viable. But let's face it, the European Union has this kind of long-term goal, even though they are not saying it in so many words, but they do punish and sanction heavily countries that refuse to accept their quota of refugees from North Africa, the Middle East, and other parts of the world. So it is very much a policy, and the far left is in fact expressing a principle that is embedded in European institutions, which of course begs the question, are European institutions in some way practicing a kind of socialism, even though they are adepts of free market and globalized economies? So that's a very interesting question. But we all know that despite its revolutionary claims and reputation, the far left makes deals with the established power structures. Macron has had a sort of a tacit understanding with the far left, and that has come out again during the last elections, when the National Rally was shrunk to size because from common agreement between all the other parties, except for a couple of them, they decided that since there are, the French system is that the first round of voting will normally not lead to one candidate getting more than 50%. If he gets 50% and more, he's elected. But if he has less than that, then all three candidates who have the highest scores above 12%, I think 12.5%, have to go for the second round. And then in that case, because there were two candidates that were not National Rally, one of them was asked to resign so that there would be only one candidate facing the National Rally. So it was in a way managing the vote. It's what you call guided democracy. And let's face it, the French system...
Nearly 200 candidates stood down in that manner.
Correct. And so basically, the absurd part of it is that people who may have voted, say, for center-right are told, well, now you have a far-left candidate, but you have to vote for him or her because otherwise you are not a good citizen and there is no alternative anyway. Otherwise, of course, you won't vote for the National Rally, so you have to vote for the comrade who comes from the Trotskyist International. So, that way, the system is managed by some parties that have made a deal that they would not let certain people or certain forces come to power. And we have two regulatory agencies in the French system. One is the Council of State, and the other is the Constitutional Council. Both of them are unelected. They are appointed, and they obviously belong to the prevailing political tendencies, primarily the center-right and the socialist. Therefore, they will naturally be hostile or prejudiced against any party, particularly the so-called far-right parties, if they make a showing which essentially brings them close to power. So you see, that is definitely not a clean system. It is a doctoral system, but that's what we have been living under for the last 70 years, since the Fifth Republic was created. Not quite 70 years, but 1958, really. So,
I want to ask you, Com, in the European elections that happened right before the French national elections, Marine Le Pen's party did really well. In fact, it really swept most parts of France apart from Paris. Today, therefore, in the UK, we talk about the London syndrome, right? That London votes in a particular way. I mean, this time also, London is almost always, hugely a Labour city. Has it become a bit like that in France, that, Paris, in a sense, does its own thing, essentially?
Yes, this is a very clear tendency, and it has accentuated in the last 30 years, so much so that Paris which centralizes most power, is indeed a very different place than the rest of France. And many of the smaller towns and rural areas feel neglected and abandoned, and they do not think at all in the way that most of Parisians think. So clearly, the results in Paris tend to be very different between center-right and left, whereas in the provinces, you find a lot of support for the National Rally and for other smaller parties, which are sort of traditional. Now, if you are looking, another interesting tendency, which is not very much talked about, is that a lot of provinces for a long time have resented the Parisian stranglehold over power. And now this has come to the point where some of them are actively campaigning for autonomy. Brittany, for example, which has a long tradition of independence, but also Alsace on the border of Germany, and Savoy, which used to belong to the Kingdom of Savoy, therefore to Italy until 1860, and Provence, which also had a long tradition of autonomy. So these regions would like to have a more federal status. And in France, that is looked upon in a very negative way by the establishment, because they think that the unity of France is the sacred precept, and you cannot think of dividing power, and they are afraid of separatism, which is what happens in some countries like Spain, for example. So they definitely frown on any such tendency, but such tendencies are growing. And I think the more Paris becomes embedded in the woke ideology and the Europeanist unity concept, in which Paris essentially concentrates all power in France and then surrenders much of the power to the European Union in Brussels, that is attracting a lot of animosity and a lot of resentment in the provinces. And I think France in the coming years will have to deal more with not so much about ideology, because ideologies are pretty much dead, but with provincial and regional separatism, or at least desires for autonomy and rejection of Parisian rule and Parisian concepts.
The interesting thing is, Combe, because this is all very dichotomous, at least to people outside France and outside Paris, right? One can understand, I believe in Paris now, in the last few months, signs or black lettering have come up in French, essentially saying that nerves are being stretched and the fascist will be hung. Andrew Hussey, the British professor, has written about this, who lives in Paris, has written about this. Now one understands that, France has a history of revolution. France has a history of being occupied by Nazi forces. So there is a natural, tendency to, essentially fight back against anything that is seen as, fascistic and extreme right. One understands that. But as far as Marine Le Pen is concerned, from ditching her own father and changing the name of the party to making a U-turn on abortion, making a U-turn on, a whole host of, on gay rights, for instance, she has come a long way. And in a sense, it seems if one reads her journey, she has consistently tried to take a more centrist position. And yet there is still this great hostility. How do you explain this?
Because it's a matter of legacy. Remember, people who have been in power for a long time, they do not want to share or give up power. So they will chase away all newcomers, even when they try to get in pretty much under the same logo. It's a little bit like some of those animal colonies, which push away all the young males that are trying to break in, because the old dominant male wants nothing to do with them. So you see, there is a little bit of that animal reaction. And of course, you can do all you want and change your label and change your colors, but they still say, yes, but we believe that at the core, you are still your old self, and you are still trying to push an agenda. And of course, if the party wants to make a change, it has to remain somewhat faithful to its original agenda. Otherwise, there is no reason for it to exist. You see, what we see now in France is a proliferation of parties which mean nothing. And there are so many of them that people don't even understand what they are for, and they don't even know of their existence. You have innumerable lists that have been created in the last few months, which are called Public Place and Renaissance and Reconquest, and goes on, and Horizon and Future. And all these people are saying the same thing. We want to make the country better, make you richer, and make Europe more united. And of course, now you have to add in most cases, and we also want to fight Russia because Ukraine has to be free. And that becomes part of a sort of a endless party line that everybody is repeating, and everybody says, where is the choice there? Some are more socialist, they want to raise taxes, and the older people, their main concern is to get their pensions paid. So they'll vote for anyone who they think will make sure their pensions are paid. And for others, it's a matter of how to get better jobs, or how to be, able to study, spending less money in their studies to get a degree. So people are preoccupied with individual narrow concerns. And overall ideologies have very little appeal nowadays. That's why Marine Le Pen had to tone down a lot of the original rhetoric. And by the way, the father was by no means what they made him out to be. He was a sort of a grumpy, somewhat, obstreperous personality right from the early 20th century. In that time, most politicians in France were like that. But he had, of course, a rather very friendly relation with Israel. In fact, he had supported Israel. He had enlisted as a soldier during the 1965 war, which very few people remember. And then he also had very good relations with a lot of African heads of state and prominent Africans. So there was no racism there. It's just that he was painted to be a horrible racist because he, of course, had an old-fashioned approach to things, and he felt we can't be invaded by these people. We have to keep our distance and we have to keep our identity, which now is considered practically an outrage. You cannot say that because then you are tagged like the RSS. It's like, oh, horrible people who want to destroy. So we have a bit of the same problem in Europe as you have in India, where a certain liberal ideology holds forth and just punishes and castigates and vilifies anything that doesn't quite agree with what they believe is the truth. It's ultimate truth, and it involves a lot of Marxism along with liberalism. I mean, it's a hodgepodge of the new economy and of some hypothetical utopian ideas of social and economic equality, which of course are not really implemented.
Here's the difference, right? In India, all said and done, we are seeing a resurgence. Even if you keep politics aside for a moment, there is a resurgence in, as India rises in the world, there is a resurgence in national identity. You can see people on the streets wanting more of culture, tradition, a national identity. That's universal now in India. And, there has been an upsurge in recent years of that. Now, I want to understand two things. France has always been a country that has had such strong national identity. It is not a country which had a wishy-washy national identity. Proud of its culture, glorious culture, great, achievements, great literature, great science. How has it come to a position today, Com, that many young people believe that all that hoary tradition, all that history does not matter, and you need, in a sense, a country where identity is not owned by anybody?
I think this is very much a position of some people in positions of power and authority, particularly a particular, I would say, globalist banking elite, banking and industrial elite that holds very commanding positions. And as you may have heard, it was now made almost public that a few of those people had brought Macron to power, because Macron was a trader, merger and acquisition banker for the Rothschild Bank. And out of that position, in very few years, he became president through a sleight of hand. And so one of the people who had practically sponsored him, Alain Ming, who is an influential, I would say an oligarch, but in France, we might call them synarchs, because they are more into the system than into practical business, individual business. However, he said that, we had brought this guy up, we groomed him, we made him what he is, and now he's betrayed us by his stupidity, because he has called these elections, and suddenly he has created enormous turmoil, when in fact he could have waited. So he has upset the apple cart, because even though he gambled and he did not entirely lose, he has still managed to keep himself afloat, because what he will probably try to do, and this is of course speculation, he will try to put together all the parties which are not either far right or far left, and then out of that, make himself again the head of a government. In other words, he would appoint one of them as a prime minister, and he would sort of try to carry on with a coalition government, in which his own party would not have a majority, but they would somehow accept to serve under him because, let's face it, everybody likes portfolios and everybody likes to be in government. So this seems to be a solution that he worked out as a sort of an attempt to remain relevant. And we believe, or there is a strong belief, that he was advised by some of the very international financiers who are very interested in France's economic future because they have heavily invested in its public debt and its companies. And one of them, of course, is BlackRock. And the chairman of BlackRock visited both Paris and London in the last few days. He met both Starmer and Macron. This was before the elections. And in fact, there is a suggestion that he was the one who told Macron to call a snap election. And the reason he had was that if France becomes either far right or far left, we would definitely lose control and trust. And that would be a big shock to the financial markets. Therefore, we should try somehow to keep the liberal center in power. And clearly, he made a deal with Starmer because Starmer is, I think they are comfortable with Starmer, even though he's Labour. And likewise, he wanted to reassure Macron, but tell him, you have to do this, otherwise you're going to be in real trouble. So if that happened, we don't know for sure, but it's likely. So that would explain why Macron has pushed it luck by trying to overcome the very bad situation that he was in after the European elections. Now, back to your question. I think most people in France are still very nationalistic, even when they may not know much about their nation or history, because let's face it, in the last 30 years, a lot of the teaching of history has been degraded and is not even being properly given. So a lot of young people and children are no longer made aware of history. Of course, before that, history might have been very chauvinistic, but at least it gave people a sense of purpose, a pride, and a sense of heritage. Whereas now, most of it has become either technocratic or it's very politically oriented. People are given all these ideas, you know, you have to be social liberal and anything else is really not good. So you have to be whatever, you know, all these woke ideas that are circulating. And as a result, they have lost their bearings, but there is still a lot of nationalism expressed in the street. You know, people are still proud to sing some of their traditional songs if they know them. They are proud to go to these fairs which celebrate the French artistic and cultural heritage. So that is there at the grassroots level. That can probably never go away. But it's just that the leadership has made a deal with the European control agencies, and that essentially is about becoming European and not French. You know, it's very interesting that Ukraine was being sold as being sort of a duty for the French to fight for Ukraine because Ukraine suddenly had become like our country. And a lot of people were saying, wait, the army was raised to fight for France, not to fight for Ukraine. So where does Ukraine belong here, considering it's not even a member of NATO? But suddenly, you know, they had tried to smuggle this idea that any part of Europe or even around Europe is still us. You know? So that sort of collective identity is not selling very well because people are not comfortable getting involved with other people's business. But it is very much the agenda. So whether this agenda can survive now with what's happening with Trump possibly coming back, with obviously the Ukraine policy collapsing because nobody can save Ukraine. And you can see that the European Union is now being torn between Hungary and some other countries that are making deals with Russia. And then the European leaders are trying to tell them, don't do that, that's very bad, you know, and they're telling them, you know, we're doing what we need to do to save our own countries. And if you don't like it, well, that's tough. So, you know, that shows you that we are at a real crossroads. And I think France will inevitably change, but there will be turmoil and uncertainty for, I would expect, a few years, because this change will not come easily. And you will have to gradually uproot the institutions that are so entrenched in the current system and do not want anything to change. See, in France, if a party is not welcome, they call it non-Republican. Now, the question is, if it goes by the electoral process, is it democratic? Well, yes, but it's not Republican. So what do you mean by Republican? That's a very culturally, you know, subjective definition. Well, it's not Republican because, you know, basically because it doesn't accept the status quo. So any change is considered non-Republican. And in that sense, it may be that the far right is not entirely Republican because they do want to bring some changes, although they say they respect the Constitution, they will not change it. But on the other hand, if you look at Mélenchon, he wants to cancel the constitution and set up a new one in order to have what he calls a sixth republic, a new republic which will have completely different principles and which will be based on socialist revolutionary ideas. So that, of course, is an old thing in France, since the French Revolution, Robespierre and all those people, there is still that sense that sometimes you have to chop heads off and create social justice at whatever cost. But whether that can happen or succeed, we don't know. But the very dangerous or explosive element is the increasing presence of immigrants, which change the demographics and therefore the voting patterns. And some French philosophers and politicians are concerned that in a few years, you may not be able to bring about a change that would be in the interest of what you might call the native French, because the influence of minorities would be so strong that they would always carry the country in the direction that they want, for example, in favor of Muslim causes, Palestinian causes, or other issues. So that in itself will create a massive shift in the position of the country in the world and in the internal dynamics of its society.
We'll come in a moment to Mélenchon and his Sixth Republic, as you called it. One of the things that I want to ask about this Sixth Republic business is that, in a sense, Macron trying to hold on to power by calling snap elections and keeping the center liberal sort of, centrist liberals rather in power has actually led to the win of the far left, interestingly. Now, interestingly, the far left not only wants to build the Sixth Republic, as we were discussing, but it also wants to pull France out of NATO. And this seems to be contradictory somewhere. On one hand, you want the country to become more European or have no Frenchness, so to speak, at all, and become this sort of creolized nation which nobody owns, whose culture nobody owns. But at the same time, you want to pull out of NATO. And how does that work?
You cannot take seriously what Mélenchon says, because he will say a lot of things that are meant to seduce a particular electorate that he's courting. Mélenchon, when he made the deal with the other leftist parties to create this new popular union, as he calls it, which is a throwback to the 1930s, when there was the first left-wing government in France, which brought together various socialist and communist parties. He's trying to do that again, but then not all of them agree at all. For example, the Socialist Party is very much pro-NATO, and there are other parties that are completely against. The Greens don't really know what they want. They're only interested in putting up solar panels and windmills and having people go on bicycles. Beyond that, they have a very pro-American agenda, but it's very wishy-washy. So Mélenchon had this position that we should get out of NATO because we are an independent country, we are a leader of the third world, therefore we have no track with all these great powers and all that. But at the same time, he signed on a common declaration in that new union of the left, and he accepted the principle that support should be provided to Ukraine in its struggle against Russia. So in a way, he followed the party line, or at least the mainstream position. Which means that he's willing to compromise on many things to get to power. And yet, we know he's an older man, he doesn't have many years left, so it's more of a last, firework for him that he can somehow become at least prime minister. But the other members of his union of the left are very concerned about it and do not want him in any event to become prime minister, because they don't share his views at all, and they think he's a rapscallion, he's a whippersnapper, so they want nothing to do with him. And one of the people who has been brought into that left union is somebody called Glucksmann, who was an advisor to the President Saakashvili of Georgia and then to President Poroshenko of Ukraine, and is widely rumored to be a CIA plant. So as you can see, the CIA and other agencies are playing their games in there, and they are putting people who can make sure that certain things do not happen, because they are there to block certain initiatives. Of course, they claim to be on the left, but that means nothing. They are basically following an agenda which is, in a way, purely financial and also strategic, and not political in the ideological sense. So I wouldn't put any trust in what Mélenchon says he wants to do, because it's very easy for him to say that he has not been allowed to do it, so he's not going to do it. And therefore, this is all meant to be consumed by people who want certain things. Clearly, the immigrant electorate has no interest in NATO. They would like France to be a supporter of the Palestinians and of the freedom of Muslim peoples, etc., etc. Same is true of Africans. They'd like Africa to get a greater freedom and autonomy and not be under a neo-colonial influence. So, for these people, you have to say certain things. But beyond that, reality remains what it is, which is that there are certain forces which will not allow certain changes to take place.
Let's talk a little bit about this immigrant vote, Com. As you were talking about this, I was remembering leaders and editorial articles written in the Daily Telegraph and other UK newspapers commenting on this Muslim vote that has emerged. Now, very problematic in the UK. Some of its leaders have ties with the Muslim Brotherhood, and they have very definitive sectarian demands. This time, of course, the sectarian demand was Gaza. And there's a lot of concern in the UK that an electorate which was always supposed to be individual, one person, one vote, one person, one opinion, one vote, is being converted into sectarian groups which can do tactical voting to bring down and candidates or uplift candidates and bring about a particular kind of political result. Do you think that this kind of fears will now emerge in France too, or has it already emerged in the last few years?
Oh, it has very much emerged. In fact, it has been talked about. Even Macron was referring to the peril of what he called separatism, which means that a group of voters in a particular region are strong enough to sway the politics of the region in favor of much greater autonomy or of certain dispositions like Sharia law. For example, Mélenchon's party would certainly accept the principle of Sharia law, which is, of course, paradoxical for a so-called Republican egalitarian party, but they feel that minorities have certain rights which supposedly majority doesn't have. So it's a very peculiar mindset, but it's there, and it's growing worse inevitably, because what is happening now, as you could see, even in the riots that took place in the last few days in France, they were motivated by the fact that the left was saying there is no way we are going to accept a right-wing nationalist government. And if we have to go to fight for what we think France should be like, then we will. And we will kill these people. I mean, many of them were actually saying it publicly. And they were not even reprimanded, because somehow killing the far-right people is not seen as such a bad thing. At least that's the view in many positions of power. You cannot go against people after inciting them for years to say you cannot accept these people, they are terrible, they are heirs of Hitler, they are going to kill you. Then, of course, if people show anger against the same people, then you have to keep quiet, because you can hardly tell them, no, you are wrong, you shouldn't, this is not democratic. So there is a lot of that insanity going on. As you know, it has been arson and destruction of public property, attacks on policemen. Some of these people are professional agitators. Remember, France has a vast tradition of just walking in the street, marching in the street for any reason. You always have a crowd of people willing to protest for something. Above and beyond that, you have got people who are specialized in attacking destroying public property, looting, attacking the police. These are the professional anarchists. And then, of course, you have people who are waiting in the background, but if they feel that their identity and you might say their communal power is being eroded, then they are quite willing also possibly to go to what you might call war or civil war. So this is what's making any kind of return of a right-wing party very problematic, because they will have to deal with a huge number of law and order issues, which will be seen as political issues, which means that it's very hard to crack down, because if you crack down, you are accused of brutalizing poor people and people who are here as immigrants. But, there is a great deal of double standards and hypocrisy there, because, for example, one of the people who was openly telling people, the French not to vote for the National Rally is a grand imam of the mosque in Paris. And he's a French and Algerian citizen. He has both nationalities, which is the case of many people of Algerian origin in France. And he was telling people, we cannot accept a nationalist French government that would that would not allow double nationality to remain, because we are not going to allow any change in this. Now, ironically, he's an Algerian citizen, which does not allow any French people to actually live there unless they are only Algerian citizens. And he has his country has an Islamic government, which is backed by the army, and it's basically a one-party system. And yet he doesn't want anything like that in France. He just wants France to remain as it is. So, you know, there is an attitude there of exploiting the weakness of the host country by saying, you cannot change your rules, so you have to live with us the way we want. But then in Algeria, that's our country, and you have no right to change the rules, you know. So you can see the inequality. And of course, they explain it by saying, yes, but we were colonized, so now it's right that we should have our comeuppance. You know, you should have your comeuppance because we are now an independent country and we can impose our own wishes. So then where does that go? You know, you come to a situation where people feel they are no longer able to make their own rules at home because there are just too many people from outside who just won't accept it. And the politicians, many of them are playing along with that. They are essentially justifying these people of saying, no, you have to respect everybody's, desire. Therefore, there are many things that are simply not allowed because you would upset them.
One wonders, again, like all of this, immediately connects to what is happening in the UK. In certain areas, even Labour candidates are being brought down by independent, candidates, all of whom have a single agenda. In this election, for instance, it was Gaza. So it could be single agendas which have nothing to do with the civic or the political needs of the country. These are all, as one British columnist wrote, this is their agenda is about a war happening 3,000 kilometers away. It has nothing to do with the needs of that constituency of the country. None of that. Now, yes, of course, some of this has been argued and theorized that, well, these European countries colonized, Africa, India, Pakistan, and so on and so forth, South Asia and other parts of the world. Now, this is just comeuppance, now these people can, they have to deal with it. But interestingly, Indians and Pakistanis, many of whom are now part of the UK, don't quite have this sort of demand yet. But of course, with the Muslim vote, these kind of demands are emerging. In France, do you think what will happen next? I mean, this seems what you're explaining and detailing, Combe, seems to suggest that a boiling point of some sort is being reached again and again. Only a few months ago on this platform, you and I were talking about riots on the streets of Paris. We've spoken about, EU elections and other things. A boiling point seems to have is being reached in many European countries, but especially in France. Where do you see this proceed from here on?
Anybody's guess, but I suspect there will be a prolonged and unfortunately a violent crisis, which will have economic, political, and social implications and aspects. And how that ends could either be a complete breakdown of the European structures and with many countries going their own way and restoring or establishing an order of their own style. Germany, of course, we can see the rise of the Alternative for Germany, which is at this point the only party, like it or not, that stands for a very different system. And they are trying to repress it, but repression is not always the best way to stop a political trend. And on the other hand, France, eventually, in my view, the system that Macron is trying to set up in agreement with some of the center-left and leftist parties is not going to be easy to run and is not going to succeed. So it will perhaps buy another year or two, but the problem that is now facing the country will continue to grow. And when the next presidential election comes, there will be a new challenge as to what happens if you have a left-wing candidate against a right-wing and probably someone in the center, because now there are three blocks, like in many other parts of the world. You have the so-called center, which is generally globalist and which tends to have monopolized the real power in the last several decades. And then you have the nationalist right wings, And then you have, of course, the far left. And the question is, who will win where? I mean, there are clearly blocks of nationalist parties that are forming, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. We know what is happening in Italy. What will happen to France is an enigma, because France is, as I said, deeply divided along ethnic and cultural lines now. And so will they be able to recover control over their destiny? Clearly, there is no more acceptance of the European Union's attempt at establishing a unified, unelected rule, which is what has been building up in the last few years. So whether the French can somehow go through a process of insurrection and overthrow the European Union, government system, if you want to call it that way, and then establish a government of their own. At this point, the National Rally is not in a position and probably doesn't want to do that. But there might be a more insurrectional force rising and then deciding to cut the links, just like Britain did through Brexit. But of course, Britain is a very special case because it has its island identity and it has its own alliance with the United States, which France does not really have. So it would be very difficult to predict how things will go. But the only thing, unfortunately, that is fairly certain is that there will be massive unrest and the collapse of many institutions, especially the financial institutions and the corporate institutions. Many of them have been closing down or have been bought out by foreign interests. So you can see that the economy, in a way, is being globalized in the sense that local people are losing control and they are becoming more and more dependent on imports from countries like China and several others.
Kum, one of the questions I had when you were talking about the unrest that's festering on the streets of Paris and other parts of France, but especially on the streets of Paris, and you even said that certain far left elements said that, if a different party or of a rightist bend comes to power, we will essentially kill people. It was that sort of tonality. Now, it occurs to me that, the rightists could use tomorrow, maybe they're not using this language today, but their people could use the same language tomorrow. And then you have a sort of civil war kind of situation.
Yes, and this has been evoked many times. Macron even said it a few days ago. He said there could be civil war, but there is an attitude on the part of the governments in Europe, which you will find also in certain political formations in India, that only the right-wing violence is dangerous. Somehow the left-wing violence is acceptable to an extent, and it can be repressed and everything can be forgotten and forgiven. Whereas the right-wing is something that is considered extremely dangerous because of historical precedents. So there are small groups of relatively violent, or at least potentially violent people in France, and they have been very harshly repressed both by the government and even by the National Rally, which has said nothing to do with that. You are out of the party if you ever say anything about, going out in the street and fighting and burning buildings. Or remember, the Élysée Palace is under special protection now because there is renewed fear of a massive attack on the government properties, on the seats of government, including the president's palace. So that shows there is a very serious threat. But at this point, it looks more likely to come from the far left, unless, of course, the far right eventually is provoked into doing something. Right now, they have been really sticking to the constitutional and electoral process. But there are a lot of people who are not happy with that, and they would like to see some more radical action because they feel that otherwise they will always be deprived of being able to get what they think they should get, simply because there is a high-level opposition that says, no, that's not acceptable. Just even if you are technically a majority, you are not allowed to do that, and you are not allowed to come to power. So that could create enormous resentment and anger. And there is, of course, a long-standing belief in France that the Le Pen family was, for a long time, used by the powers that be to keep things under control by making sure that the far right, or so-called far right, would be brought into some sort of an inoffensive margin by saying, all right, you can vote for who you want, you can express some rather radical ideas, but you are not allowed to organize in order to commit violence. So that was a sort of a cushion in order to prevent things from going out of hand. But how long can the National Rally keep that role as a sort of a relative moderator? We don't know. Because eventually, if the system no longer works, then there are, as usual, there are people who are going to be much more radical, who will say, okay, this is not working, we're going to do it by whatever means. And that's why the army has been kept under such close watch by the politicians, because also weakened to the point that now the army can't fight almost anything, because they were afraid of a strong army that might one day take sides in a political conflict. So the army has been cut down to size, but there are still paramilitary forces that could be created one day, especially if you have, let's say, Islamic militias, which could very well rise, then you would certainly have a counter force emerging. That's almost inevitable. It's a social process. You see, as a French...
This, of course. Sorry, please go on.
No, I was going to say that there is an image that I like to evoke about France. France, you might say, physiologically is a decapitated monarchy, in the sense that after the king had his throat cut, the French have remained with a very ambivalent attitude to power. They think that anyone who comes to power through elections or almost any means is a usurper, because somehow there should be a king, and of course the king does not exist, and the king is an ideal figure. So they will always put down their presidents and regard them as interlopers and crooks, and they will have a very poor opinion of them. So they will generally not tolerate them for too long. And that's been the history of the France for the last 100, 200 years.
Fascinating, especially worrying, of course, Combe, because, France is Europe's most powerful military power, as of today. And, this sort of turmoil in such a country is deeply worrisome. I guess we will all have to wait and watch, Combe. Thanks very much for this extremely detailed explanation of what's really going on. One final question before we wrap it up. Who do you think? Do you think Macron will continue as president, or do you think there is some other deal that's going to emerge, or there's going to be protracted uncertainty for many weeks, maybe even months now?
I think Macron will remain insofar as he can, because there is really no alternative. You can't have another presidential election suddenly, and technically you cannot remove him as long as he hasn't completed his mandate. So my view is that there will be a more or less protracted process to try to pick a prime minister. And Macron so far has said, I'm keeping Gabriel Attal, but of course, Gabriel Attal only represents a minority now, which is a presidential minority. So the question is whether Macron can put together a larger coalition, and then out of that coalition, a prime minister who would probably be a fairly nondescript personality will emerge, who is not a challenge to Macron, but who represents the leading tendencies in the so-called center-right, center-left, maybe a socialist. There is talk of former President Hollande being made prime minister, because he is not too controversial, except people feel his presidency failed. But still, as a manager under Macron, provided he agrees to that, which is a bit humiliating for a former president, but it could be, so that might be the sort of patch-up solution. But how long that will last is another matter, because there will be very strong opposition on the left and right, and any such government will probably have a very slim majority. So it will be at the mercy of any vote of no confidence. So let's see, there will be time will be needed to try to form a government, and they have to be careful not to disrupt the Olympics, because that would be a disaster if you have riots erupting in the middle of the Olympics. So they'd have to try to go through that, then see if they can set up some more or less viable government, and then see how long it lasts. So, it's definitely not going to be a good period, because I believe as of today, the stock market in France has been severely affected, because the international markets are withdrawing confidence. They are not happy with the scene. They think no government will be able to take any decisions, and therefore the economy will languish. And that's not good for the international overview of France as it is.
Carpentier Gourdon, thanks very much. A really detailed explanation, as I was saying. Pleasure talking to you about what's going to happen in France and Europe after this very strange and curious election result. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Hindol. Nice talking to you, and I hope we weren't too disrupted by these electronic glitches.
We will live with them. If countries can live with glitches of elections, we will live with electronic glitches. Thank you again, Com.
Thank you. Bye-bye.